Welcome to the second week of HSVC 340. I hope that everyone is enjoying the beginning of the course. Your chapter in the text this week is a thorough discussion of the history of the Human Services Movement. While I was reading this chapter, I couldn't help but think about the current state of human service delivery in our country, and I found it interesting to remember just how much the state of affairs in our profession is a reflection of the political and cultural climate of the time. You'll see this fairly clearly later in the chapter, as Woodside and McClam discuss the numerous legislative initiatives regarding our work. To begin, let's take a look at what history can tell us about the ways that people received care. During the Middle Ages, our collective thinking was not very advanced. The earliest forms of treatment for people with mental illnesses were to rid the body of evil spirits. One way that this was accomplished was by drilling a small hole in a person's skull with a tree fine. This tool is pictured here. Hippocrates, who you might remember from other history classes, was a medical doctor and the first to use the scientific approach in thinking about mental illness. His contributions were significant, and we still use certain words that he was the first to describe, such as melancholia and epilepsy. During this period of time, churches and religious institutions were often charged with providing care for needy people. Certain religious figures associated with the Catholic Church, namely St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Francis of Assisi, were considered to be the first human service professionals. Interestingly, the Catholic Church is still involved in human service work. In Western Washington, where City U's main headquarters is located, Catholic Community Services of Western Washington served nearly 100,000 clients during 2012. Their core values are the concepts of compassion, diversity, excellence, justice, and stewardship. It's interesting to me that religious institutions have often been the providers of services, and whenever we talk about the latter part of the 20th century, we'll see how the belief that churches are responsible for this work still holds true for certain political parties in the U.S. During this period of time, England was a forerunner in establishing governmental involvement in the care of the needy. It was believed to be the king's duty, and this decree had been in existence since the 13th century. As a result, government officials were often responsible for classifying individuals who were needy into two categories: idiots and lunatics. These words are still used pejoratively in our current vernacular, but at the time this was the way in which individuals were labeled so that the king or government knew what services to provide. The discussion in your text on page 30 will give you more details about this. In addition to the Catholic Church and the services that they provided, another major source of aid for needy people was hospitals. Hospitals provided medical care, but they also supported needy people with food and shelter. Asylums were being established during the 15th and 16th centuries. Unfortunately, the care that individuals received in these institutions was far from effective, and the living conditions were quite poor. During the Middle Ages, and as industrialization began, the economy began to shift away from bartering towards a money-based economy. As a result of this shift, the poor could no longer survive by bartering. England addressed this issue by creating the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601. This piece of legislation guided the delivery of human services in England and the United States for the next 350 years. Box 2.1 on page 32 in your text provides a detailed description of this piece of our history. The inhumane treatment of people with mental illness saw a dramatic shift as the 18th century came to an end. Philippe Pinel was a French physician who is often referred to as the father of modern psychiatry. He was instrumental in this movement, and he is known for unchaining 50 lunatics at a hospital in Paris. This is often referred to as the first revolution in mental health. After Pinel's action, people in mental institutions began to receive better diets, regular exercise, the right to observe religious holidays, and educational activities. Pinel was also credited with notable contributions to the classification of mental disorders. Slide 6 is a summary timeline that Woodside and McClam include on page 30 of your text. I included the timeline here as a summary. Next, we will discuss how human service work has developed in our country. As colonists moved across the ocean to America, they brought their social ideals with them, and the Elizabethan Poor Law was used as a model of public relief in America. Some of the main ideas regarding how the colonists saw their responsibility for helping others were: Poor relief is public responsibility. Legal residence was a question of practicality. Family members have first responsibility, and children of paupers were apprenticed to farmers and artisans who in turn agreed to care for them. On slide 9, I've included a photo of an almshouse. These institutions were established throughout the colonies to provide care for needy people. While local parishes had been responsible for providing services and almshouses were being created across the colonies to house and care for needy people, larger governmental units began to accept responsibility for the state poor and district warehouses were developed. Criminals were held in jails until trial, poor vagrants were told to leave town, and many times people with mental illnesses were locked up by their family members. Speaking of being locked up by a family member, I remember early in my career I did an internship at Florida State Hospital in Chattahoochee, Florida. That hospital at one time was an 8,000 bed facility. Whenever I worked there, the population was much smaller than that, of course. I was working with the geriatric population in the hospital. These were individuals who were mentally ill, and many of them had been diagnosed with dementia. While I was there, I was introduced to one client, I'll call her Mary, who was 85 years old. My supervisor at the hospital told me that Mary's parents had brought her to the hospital whenever she was 18, because they would be paid for bringing Mary in. Almost 60 years later, Mary was still there. I worked with Mary for about 6 months. At the time I knew her, she was nonverbal, so our interactions were fairly minimal. On my last day in her unit, I told my clients that today was my last day, and we began our activities. As I was saying goodbye to my clients, my supervisor walked into the room. She said, "Ellen, I want you to know, I just passed by Mary and she had some tears in her eyes. I think she knew that you were leaving." This was an incredibly powerful lesson for me. Even if my clients can't express what they might be feeling or thinking, that doesn't mean that I'm not making an impact on them. I learned from Mary that every client deserves the same level of respect and dignity, regardless of their abilities. During colonial times, providing care was an ongoing concern for social reformers and for government leaders. New state hospitals were opening, which were devoted exclusively to providing services for people with mental illness, but in general little attention was paid to the treatment of people with mental illness, as it was seen to be a social problem, not a medical one. Change was inevitable, however, and the 19th century was the beginning of radical change in many areas of society. A fundamental shift was occurring during this time, and by the 1800s, the old philosophy, based on the Elizabethan Poor Law, had changed. No longer did we consider the government to be responsible for care. The social ethos of this time was that providing aid to the destitute actually encouraged poverty, and the individual was responsible for their economic situation. In 1834, the Poor Law Reform Bill was passed, and this piece of legislation solidified this philosophical shift. Now the government was limiting the expansion of services to the poor, and what financial help they did offer was now less than what a person would make if working. All of these changes in attitude can be attributed to changes in the social evolution of the time. We were moving away from a primarily agricultural economy to one with skill-based workers. This period of industrialization solidified the collective value of individualism that has guided thinking in westernized countries since then. The individual, rather than the family or the government, was now responsible for his or her own success or failure. We were told to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and told that if we worked hard enough, we would be successful. Alongside this shift in attitude was the belief that the situation regarding those people in need couldn't be changed. It was just the plight of the working class and the poor. The government adopted a laissez-faire attitude, and social Darwinism became pervasive. All of these shifts in how we thought about social problems served to discourage the provision of human services. As the government became less involved, the private sector, specifically the wealthy individuals in the country, became important in meeting needs. Philanthropic societies emerged, and institutions were formed that would provide services. This wasn't a sustainable model, however, and eventually the private sector wasn't able to meet the needs of all of the people. There was an outcry for public agencies and institutions to pick up the slack and assume responsibility. This call was met by a few remarkable folks. First, in 1813, Judge Peter Thatcher was the first to place juvenile offenders under supervision, and then John Augustus introduced the notion of friendly supervision after paying fines for drunks and other unfortunate individuals as they worked to improve their circumstances. Finally, the Salvation Army was formed during this time period by William Booth. Alongside these philosophical and social shifts in the public attitude, treatment of people with mental illness was also changing. Dr. Benjamin Rush was important in elevating the study of mental illness to a scientific level, and Dorothea Dix was an important advocate for the living conditions of people who were housed in institutions. In addition to the individual advocacy efforts of Dr. Rush and Dorothea Dix, the government mandated that the treatment of people with mental illness was a responsibility of each state. As the current level of care was poor, the states responded by separating out people with mental illness and people with developmental disability. Hospitals were responsible for research, treatment, and aftercare. Eventually, these services were provided in outpatient clinics. During this time, the medical model of understanding mental illness was the prevailing theory, and people with mental illness were divided into two categories, those with organic brain disturbances and those with no apparent physical cause. It's interesting to me that this basic classification is still widely regarded as accurate. Mental health professionals make a distinction between mental illnesses that are organic, such as schizophrenia, depression, or anxiety, and mental illnesses that are primarily based on environmental issues, such as personality disorders. In addition to the changes in how we thought about and treated people with mental illness, the ways that we thought about and treated and cared for children were also being scrutinized. Juvenile reformatories became common as the public demanded removal of children from almshouses, and society as a whole was beginning to recognize the vulnerability of children. Compulsory school attendance rather than apprenticeships was to become the norm. In the 19th century, population shifts occurred in our country. Immigrants from abroad continued to arrive on our shores, and migration occurred as people moved out of rural areas into urban areas to find work. The population explosion caused problems, however. Urban governments had to respond, and they did so by developing the organized charity movement and the settlement house movement. You'll read about Jane Addams in The Hull House, which is probably the best-known example from this time, on page 40 in your text. Jane Addams was an impressive woman, and she even received a Nobel Peace Prize for her work. As the 19th century came to an end, the country's response to people in need experienced a shift. Here I've included a summary table of some of these important changes. This table is located on page 41 in your text. The 20th century is often referred to as the sociological era, as social reform was becoming more and more accepted. There were two significant events that affected human services. First, social work as a profession was developed. This allowed for standardized training to begin occurring. Second, muckrakers were exposing unfair practices in business, government, and labor. This allowed for a shift to occur again. People recognized that poverty was the result of economic and social conditions, not the failure of an individual. In addition to the muckrakers taking advantage of the printing capabilities of the 20th century to distribute their viewpoints, others began to write stories about the treatment of people with mental illness. One well-known example of this is Clifford Beers. Mr. Beers was a victim of mental illness, and he was institutionalized for 3 years. He experienced the deprivation and cruelty that were common during that time, and he wrote about his own story in 1945. His work, in many ways, is considered to be the beginning of the mental health movement. Some of his other accomplishments are listed here. As the public became more aware of the issues in the treatment of people with mental illness, the economy was also suffering. During the Great Depression, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt introduced the New Deal legislation and passed the Social Security Act in response to the need for human services. Seems to me that these directives signed into law by FDR marked the beginning of politically driven social support in a lot of ways. The focus on mental health continued during the mid-20th century, and social welfare systems were expanding. In 1946, the National Mental Health Act put into place the structure for what was to become the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIM. As the government established new divisions, the development of trained human service professionals was becoming an important consideration. Following FDR's lead, government support for mental health treatment continued under the leadership of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. First, Kennedy set the tone for eradicating poverty in the U.S., and then after his assassination, LBJ continued his legacy. Johnson is credited with developing a number of programs that are still active today, including Medicare and Medicaid. Here you have a summary of some of the important points from this time period. You might think about reviewing these to keep it all straight. During the latter decade of the 20th century, social welfare reform was occurring. As I mentioned earlier, it seems to me that during this time social welfare reform followed the political landscape. With Nixon's election in 1968, there was a decline in federal spending and a different way of managing human service programs. Nixon promoted the old ideal of individual responsibility in his new federalism, and SSI was established to provide financial support to individuals needing assistance. You can read more about this on page 48 and 49 in your text. Over the next two presidents, Ford and Carter, more changes were occurring, and some of those are listed here. One interesting point is that this era saw the first discussions on prevention of mental illness. As you read this section of the chapter, you'll start to notice some themes that might even feel familiar for current professionals. One that stands out for me is the reduction in the number of employees that were tasked in providing services. I've experienced this same phenomena in my work history as I was laid off from a job due to a budget cut in community mental health. When Ronald Reagan was elected to the presidency in 1980, some of the government's roles shifted again. Reagan did not believe that providing human services was responsibility of the federal government, and he cut many programs as a result. Bush continued his legacy in that he agreed that the federal government was not responsible for human services. Bush did sign the ADA into law, however, which is an important piece of legislation for the civil rights of the individuals with disabilities. The political landscape changed again in the early 90s as President Clinton worked on welfare reform. Many of the policies that Clinton enacted are still in effect today. Today, we continue to evaluate how well the welfare system works. Many professionals appreciate the focus on helping people move into meaningful work, but these same professionals are painfully aware of the multiple barriers that individuals experience in this regard. It seems like we still have a long way to go in figuring out the best way to serve people. On this last slide, you'll notice a few of the different initiatives that are still receiving attention in the media today. Although we still have work to do in determining the best ways to provide care for people in need, I'm encouraged that the dialogue continues and that there seems to be a growing awareness of the severity of these issues, especially in the last 5 years as our national economy has suffered.